Good morning. This is Shreya Sarkar Barney. Welcome to Human Capital Growth's webinar on employee selection practices for low literacy candidates. And if you've joined us before, you know that we bring science-based perspectives to trending topics. Again, this is Shreya Sarkar Barney. I'm the president and founder of Human Capital Growth. My colleague Isabella Vidlak, who usually hosts these sessions, is away today on another assignment. So I'm very pleased to be speaking with you. It's also my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest of honor and guest speaker, Dr. Victoria Davis. Dr. Davis is a global talent management and employee selection consultant with over 12 years of experience. Some of her prior roles have included heading employee selection practices at companies like Marriott International, Home Depot, and then most recently, she led talent and organizational development for JP Morgan Chase. I'm also pleased to share that Victoria is one of our expert panel members who helps us define and design the certification exams that our participants who are in the certification offering go through. Let's get to the topic of our conversation today. As many of us who do assessment work are very familiar with the methods of doing assessment for leaders, for management candidates, but what do you do when the candidates you are charged with or responsible for don't have a very high literacy level, as many of these tools are designed for working adults with a certain level of educational background. Think of organizations like McDonald's and KFC's who employ thousands of people around the world to support them in their retail stores. I'm sure you would be very unhappy if you ordered a dozen chicken nuggets and got only 6. Well, these are the types of challenges that hit home for Victoria and her team when she became responsible for managing the evaluation of over 2 million executives, management, and hourly candidates in some of her prior roles. And to compound the issue, try doing these evaluations in 27 languages. Well, quite a challenge. How did they do it? That's what Dr. Davis will share with us today in today's webinar. So if this is a challenge that you're trying to address in your organization, I can guarantee you that you will walk away with some very good advice. And for those of you who are interested, Victoria's presentation is based on a book chapter she co-authored on the same title, or a similar title, I should say. It's called Bridging the Digital Divide Across a Global Business, Development of a Technology-Enabled Selection System for Low Literacy Applicants. So Victoria, I know I do a little bit more introduction, but just wanted to see if you want to say hello to the participants today.
That's a fantastic introduction and a great overview of the business challenges that so many of us are having to address today. So I'm looking forward to digging in and having you guys have a great discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're so pleased to have you with us today. All right, let me do a really quick introduction on human capital growth. Those of you who've joined our sessions before know that we help organizations optimize their talent management practices as well as leadership, help achieve leadership excellence by using science, analytics, and empathy. We have bases in the US and in India, and you can see some of the clients that we work with. To give you a little bit more insight into the types of work that we do, we offer services that relate to the full portfolio of talent management work, starting with strategy, audit, design of systems, analytics, and education services, which is one of our largest offerings. On the leadership development front, we do a lot of assessment work around the world that go towards hiring and developing leaders, as well as we support leadership team alignment activities. For those of you who are not familiar with the Zoom platform, I'd like to provide a quick overview. If you're joining as a participant, you'll see just a small number of buttons. If you're not able to hear us, you can use the audio settings to test to adjust the volume so you can hear us better. If you need help, feel free to click on the chat feature, and you should be able to get help from our tech support team. And if you would like to make a comment by voice, feel free to raise your hand and I will promote you up to a panelist and you'll be able to speak by voice. But also feel free to chat your questions in. I will be monitoring as Victoria does her presentation, and we will take questions towards the end. And then finally, as a reminder to those of you who have joined to earn HRCI credits, this webinar has been approved for 1 HRCI credit. Please be sure to use your name when you log in. That allows us to verify attendance, which is a requirement from HRCI. So if you have any questions, please feel free to text your answers in the chat box. I'm going to start with a poll question, and then we'll turn things over to Victoria to take over the presentation. And Victoria, I know that so while I launch the poll, I know that our users are still joining, so I'm going to launch the poll. We have only a few who have joined at this time. I know that there's several who have registered, but let me just go ahead. Can everybody see the poll? Is the poll visible at this time? All right. Let's give everyone, I see the responses coming in. So the question is, which of the following certifications or degrees are you currently working toward or have completed? Certification through human capital growth, certification through HRCI, through SHRM, or a master's or doctorate degree. As you know, the SHRM and HRCI certifications have been long-standing, designed to help HR earn educational qualification. The human capital growth certification is for talent management and human capital practitioners, designed to help disseminate the science and making science practical for your day-to-day work. That's the purpose of the HCG certification. We're pleased to see that we have several of our users and HRCI and SHRM, again, great certifications for HR generalists. All right, so I'm going to end the poll, see who we have today. Most of our participants are from the Human Capital Growth certification. So Victoria, hope this information is useful to you. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. It's always interesting to see some of the background and get an idea of the participants in the audience. You know, being able to have continuing education is so important, and it's great to see that everyone in the session is involved. So thank you.
Well, thank you. So let me just stop. And Victoria, let me also give you mouse control.
There we go.
All right. So take it over from here.
Okay.
And I'll turn off my video. So, all right.
Okay, I know this sometimes takes a minute to be able to move forward. Let's see how. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just start with a little background today. As Shreya described, our topic is focused on employee selection practices for low literacy candidates. But I thought it'd be great to just kind of start for a few minutes about talking about selection practices in general. And just want to remind you, as Shreya said, go ahead and enter any questions or thoughts that you have in the chat box, and we'll do our best to kind of hit a few while we're going through the session, or we'll close out with any.
Sorry, Victoria, that was
That's
me.
okay. So thinking about the typical hiring process, the main objective of the hiring process is to try to accurately distinguish between individuals that have the capability to perform the job at a high level from those who can't. And if I can get back, there we go.
Sorry.
And this graphic helps to illustrate that a bit. It takes you through, you're creating the job, you're posting it, the challenges of sourcing to get your candidates through the door, being able to screen and assess how do we evaluate folks, interview and select. Then most folks go to offer. A lot of people are doing background checks these days. And then, of course, hire and onboard and training. Now, the two most important aspects of the selection system are its ability to streamline the hiring process and identify those applicants that are trainable and most likely to perform well on the job. As Shreya mentioned earlier, this is no small feat, especially when it comes to high volume jobs in the hourly non-management space. So things around retail, hospitality, food services. And for most of these jobs, companies actually provide structured on-the-job training. So literacy isn't always a concern when you think about evaluating. There was an interesting research report recently. In 2015, the North American Talent Board Candidate Experience Research actually collected data from about 200 companies. And they showed that more than 60% of their job postings actually had more than 200 applicants for each of those. So if you're in HR, recruiting, hiring teams, imagine having to sift through all of that. Well, to add insult to injury, the survey actually also stated about 2/3 of those people weren't even qualified for the job that they applied for. So there's got to be some way that can help us to streamline and understand closer to the front of the hiring process, where should we prioritize? Where should we be spending our time? Now, across the globe, hourly applicants tend to be of lower socioeconomic status. They have more limited skill sets, maybe a lower education level, and there may be literacy issues with their primary language. Worldwide estimates of illiteracy are coming close to 20%, and that's a statistic that has been pretty stable over the years. So when we think about the hiring process as a whole, and we're thinking about targeting these hourly roles, it's really important to try to get a sense of how do we better attract, engage, and select these folks. Being able to identify who's most trainable, who's going to perform better on the job. And more importantly, we don't want to end up passing on applicants simply because they may not be excellent at using computers or have high reading comprehension, if those things aren't even important to the job. So many organizations today are moving to an automated system and trying to use online applications, and that becomes a challenge. Let's see. Still having a little trouble with the slide advancing. There we go. So today, we're going to leverage a case study from a global Fortune 200 company, and we'll walk through some guiding principles for developing selection programs and talk about the scientific development and implementation of evidence-based selection tools. Human capital growth is really fantastic when it comes to thinking about evidence-based tools from a talent management perspective, and that's really why we wanted to try to bring this case study to you as an example today. We'll discuss in general how to conduct robust job analyses, some assessment design tips. How do you build a compelling business case? Get your leaders on board for making changes. What kind of applicant literacy challenges can we address with our tools? How do we take into account cultural and literacy considerations when we're designing the hiring process? Think about multiple languages, being able to be fair across countries and ethnic groups. And of course, how do we know when things are going well or to identify our opportunities? So we'll talk a bit about measuring success. And the way we'll go through this is we'll talk in general about selection, and then I'll bring in some examples from case studies that I've done along the way. So hopefully that helps to set the stage. And we're going to go ahead and launch another poll, because of course we want to make sure that we involve our participants and we're able to target this information a little better. So Shreya, if you could help me, please. We want to learn a little bit about what's going on in your company and what some of your challenges are.
Okay, just a minute. I'm launching the poll now.
Here we go. Great.
All right.
Okay, so the question is, when you're trying to hire for jobs with low literacy candidates, which of these might be some of your biggest challenges? And go ahead and select all that apply. Are you struggling with a high volume of open jobs? Is there a large number of candidates? What's your time to fill like? Is access to technology an issue? How about training? Anything popping with your early employee turnover? So let's take a minute where you can kind of think this through and select all that are applying to your organization now. And what I might do as you're answering the question is introduce our case study a little bit. So the Fortune 200 company that we're going to use as our example today spans more than 70 countries, over 200,000 employees, and from an hourly perspective, there are over 1.5 million applicants annually.
Wow.
And this company's actually had all of the challenges that are up on this and a little bit more. They've actually had HR staff have to help with the online application process. So let's take a minute. Shreya, how are we doing with some responses? Anyone having a chance to chime in?
Yes, great responses. Let's just give everyone just a couple seconds. We've got lots of variability here. So without giving it away, lots of challenges here. So all right, I'm going to stop the poll and share the results. What do you think, Victoria?
Well, okay, so we see language barriers are a big issue across our participants. Yes, absolutely, the number of candidates posting, some of you can feel that pain that the latest research report talked about. We see some training, and yes, early turnover, that's definitely something that comes up. So, okay, so it sounds like we can kind of all relate to the situation that we're in. We're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to some of these things. Luckily, the folks on the call today aren't having to deal too much with the high volume of open jobs. So at least that's one thing that we can cross off our list.
That's right. That's right. All right. So I'm going to stop the results here and then take it over.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
Let me know if you need me to help.
If not,
there you go.
Okay, there we go. I'll get the hang of the technology yet. So the hiring business is becoming more automated, and many programs are incorporating tests or other selection tools as part of their process. And a recent article that I read coming out of the UK, they're showing that 71% of employers in the United Kingdom are using some form of test for recruitment. In the US, where I happen to be sitting, about 60 to 70% use some sort of test as part of their recruitment process. So again, I'm going to keep trying to bring this home. That main objective is being able to distinguish through those individuals that have the capability to perform at a high level from those who don't. And there's actually an entire science and over 100 years of research focused on the development of selection tools. So we have been studying and working through these challenges for decades. And we've got a great evidence-based foundation to jump off from. As you can see on the slide, several professional organizations and regulatory entities have actually established guidelines to help us through this process. And we don't have enough time to go into detailed requirements and guidelines from each. So on the slide, I've just noted a few high-level examples. And I want us to keep in mind, while the guidelines have potential legal impact in many cases, when they're followed, we tend to end up with a better performing system. So in other words, the guidelines aren't just about avoiding legal issues, it's really best practices that are helping us to move forward. So for example, the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology, Shreya and I are actually members, and as part of this organization, we study the fields of selection and to determine evidence-based methods for the development, validation, and evaluation of selection procedures. We measure constructs that relate to work behavior and try to focus on accurately predicting employee performance so that we can get the best pre-hire data in the hands of the hiring team to help inform decisions. And we'll go through a few of these steps today that the research has told us are best practices. For folks in the US, we have the Uniform Guidelines, which is a framework for determining the proper use of selection procedures and complying with the requirements of federal law for limiting discrimination on the grounds of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Now, depending on where you are across the globe, there's other considerations that come up. Some areas have unions, or there may be contracts, work councils. These are particularly prevalent in France, Belgium, and Germany, where the workers actually have a say in how the selection system is designed. Or you may have local jurisdictions that you have to address. In Quebec, Canada, all application materials have to be in French, Canadian, and English. You can't have a hiring process that doesn't at least have those two languages. In the European Union, there's privacy regulations that govern the types of data that we can collect as part of the application process and how long those can be retained. And that's just a snapshot into legal requirements. I'm sure, depending on what country you're sitting in, there's many more that you have to be able to address. Okay, as this graphic comes up, so I think we talk about in general when developing selection tools. And this graphic kind of helps to highlight some of the guiding principles and the things that we try to address with designing tools. So we'll kind of go through some of the spokes. We want to identify candidates who are most likely to be trainable and perform well on the job. So we kind of have that starting at the top of the graph. Of course, we want to be able to treat everyone fairly, regardless of language, country, color. It's paramount to promote employee diversity, not only from varying subgroups, but we want to take into account different perspectives, personalities, work styles. Of course, this helps to breed creativity. And we want to look to cultivate our employer brand. So we really want to think about our candidate experience and how do the candidates interact with our hiring process. We want to apply efficient and effective hiring practices, think about consistent selection criteria, leverage economies of scale where we can, consider globalization. What markets are we going into next? We want to mitigate the digital divide. Some places there's issues with access to technology. If you have emerging markets in Africa, for instance, you're going to have a little more challenge with online application. And having a global selection program can help to ensure a consistent quality of candidates in terms of the knowledge, skills, and abilities, as well as prevent that common image, that employer brand, to those around the world. And it helps to reduce the cost of development and implementation when you compare to just using multiple local programs. So these are all things that we kind of consider from a guiding principle when we think about moving into selection tools. From a development perspective, let's kind of go over some basic evidence-based methods. And the first and most important thing is to identify the critical elements of the job. And we usually do that from a job analysis. So, for example, we don't want to ask someone who's going to be working on a road crew or digging ditches and laying concrete how well they can use Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, even if that is something that's kind of universal on for a company. For this type of role, we want to focus more on physical abilities, how well they can follow safety instructions, how well they can work as part of a crew. Those are some of the things that are a bit more important. So usually, we'll determine these kinds of things through the job analysis. And some of these steps are depicted on the slide. We'll ask folks to describe the responsibilities of their job, identify what tasks are performed and how frequently. Again, that idea of what's critical to the job in terms of characteristics. We'll try to group similar jobs together and then select critical components to include in the selection tool. And you can kind of see that bucket at the bottom of the screen that helps us to kind of bring things together. And from the case study company that I talked about earlier, we conducted a robust job analysis. They actually had 100 different job categories across hospitality, things like customer service, engineering, sales, housekeeping. And the goal was to whittle down and prioritize what are the most critical and common competencies that we might be able to include in a selection tool and evaluate as part of the process. So now that we've covered step one in selection tool development, we can kind of move on to that job analysis piece. We can kind of move on to the development of the process itself. So being able to identify which critical competencies are we going to use as part of the selection process versus what skills are we going to train on. Then we need to figure out, okay, are there any off-the-shelf tools that we can use, or do we need to create something new and unique to us? So to better predict our outcomes, we really need at least 2 different types of measures or tools to use as part of the hiring process. For example, a job application might capture background information. past experience with these types of jobs. We might use an assessment for skills. And then we might look at interviews for softer areas like interpersonal skills. Now, the job analysis and selection tool development, some folks do it in-house if they happen to have a large enough team, but a lot of people partner with vendors who specialize in building these competency models, designing assessments, writing interview guides, and helping us to get to a consistent process. Now, once we've got to that consistent process, it's time to move on to step 3, which is that validating and refining our tools. So for example, if we're going to use one tool or multiple tools, we need to figure out how are we going to weight them? Will every tool that we use be weighted the same, the assessment, the application, the interview? Or will one thing be weighted more than another? Maybe we'll use the application and the assessment more to screen out some folks, and then we'll use the interview to really bring it home on our decision. And once we've decided about our process and our tools, then we're set to think about launch. And for this case, we want to look at vigorously testing the technology and tools that we've put together, training our HR and hiring teams on how to use the technology and what the scores mean, and how to work through the hiring process. And finally, we'll monitor progress. We'll look at our ongoing validity and return on investment. And as that arrow indicates, it'll help bring us back to step 3, should we need to refine or make any changes. In terms of our case study company, after the company conducted the job analysis, we determined which competencies we were going to use as part of the assessment versus what we were going to evaluate as part of the application versus what we were going to explore during interviews. And then we followed the remaining development steps that are on the slide here. And I thought we'd take a couple minutes and dig a little bit deeper into that development cycle, because that's really where we get into some of those evidence-based methods and really understand what does it mean to have a selection tool that's valid and has a great utility. So the first thing we're going to do is to demonstrate validity, and that's making sure that we can show both operationally and predictive power. Now, we may collect a few different kinds of validity evidence. We want to make sure that they're job related, that they're content valid, and they have predictive power. That's really the 3 biggest. And you can see from our bullseye, that's what we're trying to hit. We need to hit our mark in those ways. And the couple of common methods when it comes to assessments are what's on that slide. The idea of operational, think about the applicant perception, and the predictive power. Now, operational validity really looks at face validity and content validity. So how does it appear to applicants, and what does the content seem like? And here we're really looking to make sure that there's a match between the content of the questions and the work that's actually done on the job. So when you think about minimum qualifications, this is a perfect example to use here. And we want to be able to link that to the job performance. And in terms of face validity, we want to make sure that applicants can see how the questions relate to what they're going to be doing on the job. For example, if a new hire is going to work with customers, then it really makes sense that some of the questions they get asked as part of the process relate to interacting with customers. We want to give applicants a realistic preview of the job so they know what they're in for. You know, sometimes we can forget this, but we really need to keep in mind that the hiring process is a 2-way street. Just as companies are trying to identify who the best people are to hire, candidates are trying to learn about the job to see if it suits them. They're trying to understand the potential work environment. They want to see if they're comfortable in it. They're trying to see what the company's like. Does it fit their values? They're really looking to make an informed decision to figure out if the job and the company are right for them. And that's just as important as us trying to figure out if they're right for our company. So from our case study, again, we're thinking about a hospitality company. So we did a few things to try to foster this content validity. And the biggest thing that we did was we actually went to current employees and their managers. And we asked them to come up with scenarios for the test. We did focus groups, and employees provided critical incidences as examples for our design team. And then we went ahead and adapted them into scenarios and questions. And some of the pictures here on the screen you can see. We looked at scenarios that related to housekeeping in a room, the dining area with food service. How do we set up the landscaping? So the resulting assessment actually included pictures from company locations to set the scene. So when an applicant came into the assessment, they actually saw a place that they might be eventually working in. From an example of customer service, these situations came straight from the mouths of employees who had experienced them firsthand. Even the color scheme on the assessment website reflected our employer brand. We tried to bring that through from consistency and trying to welcome them in. And we looked at construct validity to make sure that we use the right questions to measure what we're trying to evaluate. And of course, we want it to be reliable. Make sure that we're measuring the same thing in the same way over time. Now, for low volume positions, you and your vendor partner may pause there and gather criterion validity evidence over time. But for high volume positions, like a couple of you put forth in the earlier poll where you have high volume positions, you're going to more likely to gather the criterion evidence before you launch. That way you can be sure that you're going to be able to predict performance on the job. So let's take a look at an example of how we can demonstrate predictive power. And it takes a little bit more work, but we look at that construct validity to make sure that we're measuring the skills we want to measure. So for example, if we want to evaluate trainability, okay, we want to know how well someone will be trained, then we want to make sure that we use questions that evaluate an applicant's ability to provide insight on how they follow instructions. Can they read them or hear them and understand them? How do they then carry out actions based on those instructions? Just like what they're going to do on the job when they get trained. And we want to link those competencies that we're measuring directly to performance on the job. And there's a few ways that we can do that. So here we'll kind of look at how did our case study company do it. So our company was dealing with high volume positions, and we took the step of examining predictive power by conducting what's called a concurrent validation study. And what this means, just as the graphic shows on the slide, we assessed current employees. So we administered our new assessment to current employees, and we gathered performance data. We asked their managers to rate them on their job performance. In some cases, we looked at more objective measures like productivity and sales figures. We then performed analyses and created a scoring algorithm using the current employee information as a benchmark. And some companies may go and create a cut score. So when they think about their scoring algorithm, we'll say, okay, applicants who come in and take this assessment, they have to reach a minimum threshold. And anyone above that will move forward in the process. That's what a cut score. And doing this kind of validation study can help you to figure out, okay, what type of characteristics, what type of score are we looking for with our applicants? And we do that by looking at the current employees and their performance to try to figure out what are the characteristics of our high performers, and then we match that as a score to help us evaluate our applicants in the future. Some folks may have multiple hurdles in their process. They'll use the job application, they'll use the assessment, and they'll use their interview. And that's all possible. What we're just talking about right now is this example of if we're using an assessment, how do we go about creating that? For our case study company, we're actually going to launch globally. So we conducted our validation study in multiple languages because we wanted to make sure that people who perform one way in English or Spanish, it would perform similarly in French or Portuguese. So we went and we looked at multiple languages to make sure that there wasn't any difference in whether you took the assessment in one language or another, or you were from one culture or another. If we think back to some of those guiding principles, this was especially important legally from a US perspective because we needed to show that there wasn't any adverse impact or difference across subgroups. Some of the data that we looked at to help us evaluate folks were the tenure enrolled with the company. Some folks mentioned earlier in their poll that they have trouble with get early turnover, so we wanted to make sure to address that, as well as productivity. Now, it may seem costly to do a criterion validation study, but we actually run the risk of leaving money on the table if we don't, because this helps us to tweak the story and really make sure that we're getting the most out of our assessment tool. I want to take a minute and do another poll with everyone. And this is, again, helps us to kind of figure out what are you guys addressing in your organization. So Shreya, if we could launch poll 3.
All right, wonderful. Just give me a second. And we'll get that started soon. So poll 3 launching now.
Okay. So just like our graphic showed some multiple hurdles here, we want to go ahead and ask you all in your organization, what types of tools are you currently using as part of the hiring process? I imagine most of you are probably using more than one tool. So let's go ahead and take a quick poll to see some of the types of things that you all are using.
Yeah,
So here we've, okay.
Yep.
We've got resume job application, phone or video screening. Maybe you're doing some interviewing or some skill testing or cognitive ability tests. Some folks look at personality. Simulations of job tasks and job knowledge. A situational judgment test, that might be that customer service scenario that we're asking folks to put in. Or maybe you're looking for a culture fit with your organization. Let's give it a couple more seconds. And let's see some of the things that you all are using in your organization. I'm just going to take a quick sip.
All right. I see some of you haven't voted. Just a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll. All right. And so here you go.
Okay, so everybody's using a resume or job application. We've got some folks are doing some phone or video screening. I know the video is something that's kind of new coming out. The majority of people are doing that behavioral interview, which is great. We get so much value and information from that. We see someone using a cognitive ability test and a personality inventory, the job simulations. Some folks are using the scenarios. And it doesn't look like anyone is currently using the values or culture fit. And that's something that's a little new when it comes to organizations. Okay, so we can go ahead and close that. Thank you, everybody who answered. So just as you all are using multiple tools, research shows us that using multiple methods as part of the hiring process really is the best way to increase the effectiveness and validity of the hiring decision. You know, all of the tools that were on the poll, and Trey, I'm having a hard time moving forward. There we go. They were on the poll, and we have kind of a menu here of some examples. They all have a certain amount of validity or utility to them. And just like choosing from a menu at the restaurant to try to decide, okay, you know, what dish are we going to use? Some of them have been higher rated than others. And so this menu we can kind of see from each one has stars. Our highest validity items have more stars. Our least validity items have lower stars. And the type of tool that we choose to use, it's going to come down to a few things. It's the type of position that we're looking at, so the type of job. It's also the type of culture. So, for example, cognitive ability tests, while they're great for jobs that have a lot of logic reasoning or mental acuity with them, sometimes they've been shown to have adverse impact. So they might have a little bit of a difference across subgroups. And so realistically, we know that business typically isn't the only thing that's important for a job. So here's an example of something that's good to use in combination with something else. So you make sure that you have fairness across your groups and you're gathering additional information. From a cultural perspective, we want to think about the assessment questions and responses that we use. So if you think about using the same test in different countries, the preferred leadership style or management style may be different based on the culture. The most effective communication skills to use may be different in different countries or cultures. So you kind of want to think that through when you're putting together and choosing from your menu. Make sure that you're choosing things that are really core to the company and the job type and that don't vary as much by culture. And then when it comes to different tools in the hiring process, if you're hiring for a manager in India versus a manager in China or a manager in the US, then you may want to think about other types of questions or scoring because what you're looking for there is going to be slightly different. And having this menu of selection tools really does help us to put together the best portfolio for moving forward. So thinking about building that compelling business case, you know, we just talked about a number of different selection tools that you can use, but how do you get folks on board with the decisions and the direction you want to go? You know, thinking about focusing on the jobs that have the highest headcount, the highest number of applicants per job posting. We saw some of that at the beginning. Some folks that have the greatest early turnover in their jobs. Or maybe it might be focusing on jobs that have the longest time for an employee to reach proficiency. So really think about what your target jobs are and then your target population. And again, sometimes that can be the low literacy group from an hourly position, or it may be thinking about different cultures that you have to take into account. But being able to know your data and understand your retention metrics, what your turnover costs are, your cost per hire. Think about the time spent in the interview cycle. You can quantify the time that the HR leaders are spending on there. So really help to bolster your case of, here's what it costs now, and if we make a few changes and customize this to the people that we're trying to hire, we can actually make this more efficient and effective. Now, for our case study company, what that meant was focusing on housekeeping, food services, landscaping jobs. These were the jobs that tended to have the highest turnover and the lower minimum qualifications when it came to literacy. Applicants for these types of jobs didn't need to be fluent even in their native language or experts in reading, nor did they need to be fully computer illiterate. They just needed to be comfortable with technology and do some of the basics. They needed to be able to follow instructions and interact well with others. So from an application perspective, as a company, we were really looking to try to automate our system, but we also needed to make sure that the process and the assessment were basic and easy to navigate as possible, so we can meet the needs of the company, but not be prohibitive to our low literacy applicants. And running through these data really helped us to build our business case and get to behind the why. So thinking about balancing those literacy concerns, we talk about the why and we talk about our target jobs. So what's different when it comes to balancing literacy concerns for those low literacy applicants? We want to more thoroughly consider their characteristics and the ways we can make the tools more user-friendly to better engage them and streamline the experience. And we have here on the slide this idea of a balancing act. So we want to be able to cover the critical competencies and make the assessment user-friendly. So how do we do that? Well, try to use more visual stimuli, pictures or video. Use text sparingly. And when you do, think about a low-level reading level. Keeping things as short as possible. Ideally, having the tools available in multiple languages so you can make sure to cover the languages in the countries you're targeting. Very basic web navigation, limited scrolling. If you can have audio, that's fantastic. We had great feedback when it came to audio. So from our case study company, when it came to the process and the online assessment, we used all of these things to try to hit the mark. And we were evaluating things like learning ability, detail orientation, interpersonal skills. So when they first accessed the system for our company, they were able to choose from 27 different languages. They could have audio where the text was read aloud to them. We only had one question per page, so that helped to limit the scrolling. And when the applicant selected answers, we actually had the answer change color, so they had another indication that there was a difference. And they could use their mouse or their keyboard. Now, I actually have a few slides with the assessment questions for you. And Shreya, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go ahead and launch the poll. We'll just kind of talk through these.
Okay.
So our first sample assessment question is looking at detail orientation and learning ability. We presented them with instructions, and you can see this is a hotel room. So this would be an example of a housekeeping question. And it shows how the hotel room must be arranged, and they're presented with a few different instructions. And then we show them another picture, and we say, okay, how many mistakes were made? So based on what they just saw, they then have to see, okay, what's different about this picture from the one before it? So that idea of we've given you instructions, you can understand the instructions, and then help to see, okay, what's wrong? And when they go into a hotel room, that's what they're going to have to figure out. What's wrong? What do I need to fix? This next one was getting at their detail orientation and just in general what their perceptions were. And we showed them, this is a hotel bathroom, and we asked them to say how neat or messy is the area. And we gave them a few options: very neat, neat, messy, very messy. And asked them to judge for themselves. And this type of item is scored based on the validation study. So based on what our current employees were telling us on their perception of this type of thing, we wanted applicants to try to match that up. The next question, this is called a biodata or background question. And the applicant's asked to select the preferred response for themselves. So this one just asks, how often would others say that you've made customers happy? So more often, about as often, not quite, or maybe you haven't worked with customers. Because we certainly don't want to penalize someone that hasn't done it before. And we would ask them to respond to the question, and then based on what we had learned during our validation study, we went ahead and scored it. So if they were to say that more often than most people or about as often, they were giving a point. If they haven't worked with customers before, they didn't have an additional point. It could be that if not quite as often, that may become a negative point. Because obviously, in this case, we're also trying to weed out some of that background information. We'll go ahead and skip poll 4. So then this next piece is that cultural component. And a significant challenge with most global selection programs is being able to develop a tool that works well across nations and cultures. And so these are some of the cultural considerations that we want to take into account. Because it's not just about literacy. A lot of times people think about bilingual or literacy in the main language of the company, but it's also about literacy in the culture. You want to make sure that if you're going to launch this tool in multiple languages, that you do it in a way that excels and makes sense to different cultures. And we talked about having an assessment in English, and then from our case study company, having assessment in English and then launching it in 27 additional languages. Well, from that perspective, you can't just go and say, okay, here's the questions we're going to use, now translate them. It takes a little bit more work than that. And these are some of the considerations that came up. You want to think about the tone of the expressions that you're using. For instance, I learned when we were getting ready to launch in Japanese that if you had a customer service scenario where someone was arguing, when that translates into Japanese, we were told that that actually meant that they might be having a physical fight. So we toned that down and made it disagreement. So you want to make sure that what you're saying makes sense to the culture. If you think about localizing content from a temperature perspective, do you use Fahrenheit or Celsius? These are some things to think about. And what's great is if you can actually use local SMEs. So you're not just translating the content, you're asking folks in the culture who also speak English to take a look and compare and make sure that what you're going to put forth in all of the languages really makes sense and represents your employer brand well. And some of these examples on the slide are ways in which we can do that and take into account those cultural considerations while also keeping with the literacy concerns. Okay, Trey, if we could launch this poll, because this will help to kind of close us out.
All right.
So we've gone ahead and we've talked about our guiding principles. We've talked about how we can create tools and what we need to think about from a low literacy perspective. So how do we know if we got there? And Shreya is going to launch a poll right now that asks, how are you guys measuring success in your organizations right now?
Just a minute. We're looking for that question.
It should be the last one in the list.
Okay.
And this is my fault, I know, because we skipped a couple along the way.
No problem. Okay, so we're ready now?
Okay, and this is again a multiple choice. Go ahead and indicate any of the ways that you're currently, in your company, that you're currently evaluating your selection tools. How do you know that you're hitting the mark or where your opportunities might be? And we've got that predictive validity that we had some examples on. Maybe you're doing some applicant surveys, asking applicants what their reaction is to your tools. Are you talking to your HR professionals? Are you looking at quality of hire? Evaluating folks when they're first coming in on those 30, 60, 90 days? Or maybe are you looking at training effectiveness? Are they completing training? How's your time to fill or your turnover? Are you looking at any cost implications or return on investment measures? And we'll give it another few seconds.
Yeah, responses coming in. So
Great.
Just a couple more seconds. If you haven't voted yet, please respond.
And now give me a second for a drink.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. And Victoria, sharing the results, and over to you.
Oh, this is great. Lots of people are collecting lots of information. You guys have some rich data to play with. We actually have someone who is looking at some of that predictive validity. 75% of people are using applicant surveys. Those are a great source of information. It looks like we're not evaluating getting evaluation from our HR managers or hiring as of yet. Some folks are looking at quality of hire and training. Good, you're keeping an eye on that time to fill and some of those turnovers. Yeah, those costs really can help from a business case perspective. And if you look at those over time, it helps to build that business impact or return on investment measures. Great, so let's go ahead and close the poll. I think I was able to do that.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
And I just want to go to the next slide. I think I need your help.
Sure. I think there's just a little bit of a lag when you and I both control it. There you go.
Okay, there we go. So this slide is an example of what our case study company used to evaluate their success and try to kind of get under the hood of what could they do better. We've conducted a number of studies over the years since these launched and found that we were better predicting performance and promotion. And if we think about our evaluation, we kind of have three buckets here. So those users, collecting candidate feedback, which some of you said you do, which is great. We also went to our HR professionals and hiring managers. We had a few different ways to demonstrate predictive power, using that quality of hire, measuring training completion and passes, tracking early turnover. Those are some additional ways that you can help to measure that predictive power and not just the job performance in itself. From a turnover perspective, we saw some great results. It was negatively correlated with assessment scores. So those hires who scored well on the assessment, they tended to stick around longer. So that was another good win for us. And we've actually done comprehensive business impact studies. We did it a year later, and then we've replicated that a couple more times to be able to see what the difference is from our cost perspective and the time that we're spending on the hiring process. Implementing those low literacy solutions really helps the people at the hotels and the locations on the ground. It saved HR staff time. People didn't need as much help going through the application process. They were able to navigate it themselves. So some of those tips that we talked about earlier really can make a difference if you think about ways to incorporate those into your current process. Okay. So to just kind of wrap up, some of the things that we wanted to make sure we were able to do today. Hopefully we've been able to bring an increased awareness of the selection tools and what tends to be most reliable and valid predictors. Hopefully we've broadened your knowledge a bit on developing and validating the global selection procedures, getting into a bit more of that evidence-based methods to bring them to life. Hopefully we've been able to share some tips about the selection practices on how do we better engage and evaluate low literacy candidates and take into account some cultural considerations too. And then of course what we just closed out with is ways in which you guys are already defining and measuring your success and other things that we can help to kind of bring it home from an organizational perspective. So we have about 6 minutes left according to the clock. Have any questions come in or would anyone like to comment?
Well, I'm just checking the chat. This was very, very helpful, Victoria. The examples, the detailed representation of the processes. Sorry about that. I think that our audience will be able to at least walk away with, if it's a need they have, what are the steps they would need to take? So I really, really appreciate the very detailed overview. Let me see if there's any questions that have come in the chat window. Again, please feel free to text, and if you would like to ask by voice, raise your hand, and I should be able to promote you to a panelist, and you can ask by voice. So I'm just checking my screens here.
And my contact information is in the slides, so if you walk away and things start to, I know from my perspective, kind of think about things a little bit more and other things come to mind, please go ahead and reach out. I'm happy to have an email exchange or conversation too.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate that. So Victoria, a question I have for you, I'm really curious. Prior to instituting these assessment practices, was there any assessment happening?
We were doing one assessment. We had not launched globally. It was only available in the US. We had an application and assessments in English and Spanish. So as you can imagine, being able to try to think about efficiencies and scaling up with a selection solution, we had a lot of things to consider and try to put into that first launch.
Makes sense. And I'm curious, what was the acceptance of this new method?
It really depended on where you were. The western side of the globe was very accepting. In some areas in China, like Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, those places were very accepting of the assessments. We had some struggles in Europe, and part of that is because of those legal implications when you think about the work councils and the privacy concerns. So it took us a little longer to get off the ground there. And that's why I included that slide of, okay, we kind of need to think about some of these things. The other thing I would say is think about language. When we first launched, like I said, it was English and Spanish. Well, when we went global, we had to think about Latin American Spanish. We had to think about Spanish as it was used in the US. We had to think about Spanish and how it was spoken in Spain, because we had locations in all of those areas. So you really need to think about culture and country and language and literacy. It's really a bunch of things all at once that you're trying to, that balancing act.
Makes sense. And you know, to address that point, did you all experiment with non-verbal tests where there's very little need, they didn't need to provide any kind of written or verbal instructions?
No, we didn't take that away completely. What was really important was if you could understand at least the verbal piece in your own language. And that's where the pictures and the audio component of some of the assessments really came in, because we had folks that would come in, they weren't necessarily literate from a reading perspective, but as long as someone talked them through and walked them through the training, that's what, then they were able to go ahead and excel. So we need to make sure that when we launched the assessments, that was taken into account, that everything wasn't just about the verbal piece, wasn't just about being able to read. You really wanted to understand concepts as best you could. Unfortunately, from a global perspective, we can't completely take out the written word, because legally a lot of people have to fill out some sort of application. Makes
sense. All right, well, this is a great overview, Victoria. Just goes to show the amount of detail that goes into the work as well. This is definitely something that you need expertise to do, and we are so pleased that you shared your expertise with us today, along with a case study of how it was done. So,
my pleasure. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I'm sure that users will reach out to us. I don't see any coming in. Manasa, have I missed anything? Do you see any chats? Sometimes we have a quiet audience. So here's what I'm going to do in the interest of time. We have only a minute left. I will close it out, but if you wouldn't mind just staying for just a couple more minutes, just in case we have questions.
Sure, and I'm excited to hear what's coming next with human capital growth.
Absolutely. So let me talk about that. Next, we will talk about employee engagement surveys. Everybody's doing it, and a lot of companies are questioning if that is the way to go, or is there another approach? We will address the topic of are they drivers or a waste of time. So stay tuned. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, October the 27th at 8 a.m. Pacific time. And as many of you know, we will send out registration information. If you haven't already signed up with us, feel free to do so by either registering or just leaving your name on our website. And also you can look in our events section and sign up for either any of the past webinars. You can view the recordings, or a future webinar, you can definitely sign up for it. So I want to thank everyone who took the time to join us today. We greatly appreciate it. Just as a reminder, Human Capital Growth is offering a 1 hour of free consultation on any of the services that you see over here. As you know, we offer a full portfolio on talent management services that are based on science and evidence. It includes setting strategy, understanding where your business is, what the demands are, and what are the human implications of that, audit, design, analytics, and education. And also we do a lot of leadership assessment work. So having said that, I want to thank our guest speaker today, Dr. Victoria Davis. Thank you again for this very, very informative session, and also something that's going to become very important. Service industry is never going to stop hiring humans, at least for the foreseeable future. Many other parts of the industrial world is becoming automated, but I think the service industry will continue. So lots of great applications here. Thank you again, Victoria, and thanks to all of you who took the time to join us today. You'll receive a copy of the presentation as well as the recording. Feel free to share among your colleagues who you think will benefit from it. So having said that, thank you all and have a wonderful day or wonderful evening based on where you are in the world.